The quiet cost of needing approval. There is a subtle tension that exists in the background of many people's lives, though few recognize it clearly. It appears in small moments, before speaking in a group, before sharing an opinion, before making a decision that might not align with what others expect. In these moments, the mind quietly asks a question that often goes unnoticed: how will this be received? That question seems harmless on the surface, but over time it begins to shape behavior in ways that are deeper than most people realize. The need for approval rarely announces itself as dependence. Instead, it disguises itself as politeness, cooperation, or social awareness. People learn early that agreement often creates comfort, and that disagreement can invite tension. So gradually, without realizing it, they begin adjusting their expressions and choices in order to maintain acceptance. This adjustment becomes routine. Opinions soften slightly. Decisions are delayed until they feel socially safe. Certain thoughts remain unspoken entirely. What most people miss is how quietly this pattern begins to influence clarity. When the mind repeatedly checks for approval before acting, it slowly learns to filter truth through the expectations of others. Instead of asking whether an idea is accurate or meaningful, the mind begins asking whether it will be welcome. The focus shifts from understanding reality to managing perception. This change happens gradually, often without any conscious intention. In social environments, approval functions like a form of emotional currency. Positive reactions, agreement, praise, or validation create a sense of relief. They confirm that the individual remains accepted within the group. Negative reactions, however subtle, create discomfort. A moment of silence after an opinion, a raised eyebrow, a tone of disagreement. These signals can cause the mind to reconsider what it just expressed. Over time, this cycle creates a quiet habit. People begin adjusting themselves before the reaction even occurs. Instead of waiting to see how others respond, they anticipate possible disapproval and modify their thoughts in advance. What begins as social sensitivity slowly becomes internal censorship. The mind stops exploring certain ideas simply because they might not align with collective expectations. This is where clarity begins to weaken. When approval becomes the hidden standard for behavior, independent thinking gradually loses strength. The individual may still believe they are acting freely, but their internal compass has already begun to shift. Decisions are no longer guided entirely by personal judgment. They are influenced by an invisible audience that exists in the background of every choice. This invisible audience does not only influence speech, it shapes identity. A person who frequently seeks approval begins to measure themselves through the reactions of others. Praise strengthens their confidence, while criticism unsettles it. Acceptance feels like confirmation of worth, while disagreement can feel like a threat to it. As a result, emotional stability becomes tied to external signals, rather than internal understanding. The difficulty with this arrangement is that external reactions are constantly changing. What one group approves of today may be rejected by another tomorrow. Opinions shift, expectations evolve, and social environments transform. When identity depends heavily on these shifting signals, the individual finds themselves continuously adjusting in order to maintain stability. Yet there is another path that begins with awareness. The moment a person begins to notice how often approval influences their thinking, a different perspective emerges. They begin observing their own hesitation before speaking, their instinct to soften certain truths, and their impulse to align quickly with the dominant tone of a conversation. These observations are not signs of weakness. They are signs of awareness beginning to replace habit. Once this awareness develops, something important becomes visible. Many decisions that once felt natural were actually shaped by subtle emotional pressures. The individual realizes that their thinking was not entirely their own. It had been quietly guided by the desire to remain accepted. This realization can feel unsettling at first, but it also creates an opportunity. Because once the pattern is recognized, it can begin to loosen. The mind starts to separate clarity from approval. Instead of immediately adjusting to maintain agreement, it pauses. Instead of asking whether an idea will be liked, it considers whether the idea is accurate or meaningful. This shift is small but powerful. It restores the original purpose of thinking to understand rather than to please. As this process continues, the emotional weight attached to approval begins to diminish. Praise still feels pleasant, and disagreement still carries tension, but neither becomes powerful enough to redefine the individual's direction. The mind learns to tolerate moments of uncertainty without rushing to repair them. This tolerance creates a new form of psychological stability. Instead of constantly adjusting to maintain approval, the individual begins to rely on their own reasoning process. Decisions become slower but more deliberate. Conversations become less performative and more honest. The person becomes less concerned with immediate acceptance and more focused on long-term alignment with their own understanding. Over time, this shift changes the structure of identity itself. Approval is no longer the quiet force shaping every decision. The individual no longer feels the same urgency to adapt their thoughts to match the expectations around them. Their sense of direction becomes rooted in internal clarity, rather than external reassurance. The transformation is rarely dramatic. It unfolds gradually through repeated moments where the individual chooses understanding over acceptance, reflection over reaction, and truth over convenience. With each of these moments, the influence of approval weakens slightly, and the mind becomes more comfortable standing within its own evaluation of reality. The authority of the unaffected mind. There is an unspoken rule in human interaction that most people sense but rarely examine closely. It appears in conversations, decisions, and even in silence. The more someone depends on being liked, the more carefully they begin to shape themselves around the expectations of others. What starts as a natural desire for connection slowly evolves into something more subtle, a quiet negotiation between authenticity and acceptance. At first, this negotiation feels harmless. People adjust their tone slightly in certain conversations. They soften their opinions in environments where disagreement may create tension. They choose words that feel safer rather than words that reflect what they actually think. These adjustments seem small, even polite, yet repeated over time, they begin to reshape how a person moves through the world. Human beings are highly sensitive to approval because social belonging has always been tied to survival. Throughout history, remaining accepted within a group offered protection and stability. The mind still carries traces of this instinct today. When someone senses approval, it creates a sense of ease. When approval feels uncertain, it triggers subtle anxiety. Most people respond to that discomfort by adjusting themselves until the tension disappears. But this constant adjustment comes with a quiet cost. The more someone relies on approval as emotional confirmation, the more influence others gain over their internal state. Reactions from the outside world begin to shape how they interpret themselves. A compliment can strengthen their confidence for a moment. A disagreement can weaken it just as quickly. The individual becomes sensitive to signals that were never meant to define their direction. Over time, this sensitivity creates a pattern. People begin monitoring the emotional climate of every environment they enter. They look for cues in facial expressions, tone, or silence. These signals quietly guide their behavior. When approval appears strong, they feel confident moving forward. When approval weakens, hesitation enters their decisions. Their confidence begins to fluctuate with the atmosphere around them. This is where emotional independence becomes powerful. When someone gradually stops measuring their actions through approval, the relationship between themselves and others begins to change. They no longer feel the same pressure to secure agreement before moving forward. Instead of constantly adjusting their thinking to match the expectations of a group, they allow their reasoning to stand on its own. This shift often surprises people around them. In many social environments, individuals unconsciously expect others to respond to approval cues. When someone speaks or acts without visibly seeking validation, their behavior stands out. They appear less reactive, less eager to align quickly with the dominant tone of the room. Their responses become measured rather than immediate. This composure creates a different form of presence. When someone is unaffected by the emotional pressure of approval, they move with a steadiness that is difficult to imitate. Their words carry more weight because they are not constantly adjusted for acceptance. Their silence becomes more noticeable because it is not driven by fear of disagreement. They appear comfortable allowing conversations to unfold without needing to control how they are perceived. People often interpret this steadiness as confidence. But the deeper reality is more subtle. What appears as confidence is often the result of emotional independence. The individual has removed the invisible negotiation that once shaped their behavior. Instead of constantly balancing their thoughts against the approval of others, they operate from a quieter internal reference point. This independence changes how others interact with them. When someone is not seeking approval, they become less predictable to those who rely on approval signals to guide conversations. Many social interactions depend on subtle emotional feedback loops. A smile invites agreement, hesitation invites reassurance, disapproval invites correction. These loops create a rhythm that keeps conversations comfortable and predictable. But when a person stops participating in that rhythm, something shifts. Others begin observing more carefully. Without the familiar signals of approval-seeking behavior, they cannot easily predict how the individual will respond. The person who remains emotionally unaffected becomes harder to influence through subtle reactions. This is not about control or dominance. It is simply the natural consequence of emotional independence. When someone no longer depends on praise to feel secure or criticism to feel threatened, their reactions stabilize. They can listen without immediately defending themselves. They can disagree without feeling compelled to justify every word. Their thinking remains anchored even when the emotional atmosphere around them changes. Over time, this stability becomes visible. people begin to notice that the individual does not shift direction easily under social pressure. They do not rush to align themselves with every opinion in the room. Their perspective remains consistent across different environments because it is not being adjusted for approval. This consistency creates trust. Not the shallow trust that comes from constant agreement, but the deeper trust that comes from reliability. Others recognize that the individual's thinking does not fluctuate depending on who is present. Their words reflect genuine evaluation rather than momentary alignment with the group. Gradually, the absence of approval-seeking behavior becomes a quiet source of authority. The individual does not need to announce their independence. It appears naturally through the way they speak, pause, and observe. Their composure signals that their internal structure is stable. They do not require constant reassurance to maintain their direction. And when someone reaches that level of emotional independence, their presence begins to influence environments in a different way, not through force, persuasion, or control, but through the quiet stability of a mind that no longer depends on approval to remain steady. Discipline beyond validation. There is a moment in the process of self-mastery that most people rarely talk about. It happens quietly, often without recognition, and it begins with a simple realization. Much of our behavior has been shaped by the expectation of being seen. The presence of observers, whether friends, colleagues, or strangers, creates a subtle pressure that organizes how we act. People become more disciplined when others are watching. They become more careful with their words when reactions are immediate. Even motivation often increases when there is an audience capable of noticing effort. But when that audience disappears, something else becomes visible. Without external attention, the structure that once supported behavior begins to loosen. Habits that once appeared strong begin to weaken. Discipline that felt natural suddenly requires conscious effort. Many individuals discover that their consistency was not entirely internal. It had been supported by recognition, expectations, or social accountability. This discovery can feel uncomfortable. For someone accustomed to acting within environments where behavior is constantly observed, solitude introduces a different psychological landscape. There is no applause, no approval, and no quiet reinforcement from others acknowledging effort. The mind, now free from observation, begins negotiating with itself. One part seeks ease and comfort. Another part remembers the commitments that once seemed important. This internal negotiation reveals something essential. Discipline that depends on recognition is not yet fully owned. It is partially borrowed from the structure created by others. When people feel seen, they often rise to expectations. When the environment signals that effort matters, they maintain their focus. But when those signals vanish, the mind begins questioning whether the effort is still necessary. At this point, many people unconsciously return to comfort. Without external validation, the reward system that once encouraged discipline becomes weaker. Effort feels less meaningful when no one is present to acknowledge it. Tasks are delayed. Commitments are softened. The individual gradually returns to patterns that require less energy. In these moments, discipline appears to fade. Yet there is another possibility hidden within this stage. For those who remain aware of the internal negotiation taking place, solitude becomes a training ground. Instead of viewing the absence of recognition as a loss, they begin to see it as an opportunity to build something deeper. Every action taken without external reward strengthens a different kind of commitment. The commitment to personal standards rather than social reinforcement. This shift is subtle but transformative. When discipline is practiced in solitude, it becomes detached from applause. The individual begins to act not because someone might notice, but because the action itself aligns with the identity they are shaping. The reward moves inward. Instead of relying on approval to confirm progress, the person begins measuring themselves against their own principles. This internal measurement system is quieter, but far more stable. External validation is unpredictable. Praise can appear unexpectedly and disappear just as quickly. Social environments change, and with them the signals that once reinforced behavior. But when discipline becomes rooted in personal standards, it no longer depends on the presence of others. The individual carries their structure with them. Solitude accelerates this transformation because it removes the distractions that once masked internal patterns. Without the influence of constant social interaction, the mind becomes more aware of its impulses. Procrastination becomes easier to recognize. Emotional reactions become more visible. Habits that once blended into daily routines now appear clearly. This awareness creates the possibility of change. Each moment of self-regulation in solitude strengthens psychological control. Choosing effort over comfort when no one is watching builds a different form of resilience. It teaches the mind that discipline is not a performance. It is a private agreement between intention and action. Over time, this agreement becomes part of the individual's identity. As discipline becomes internalized, the need for validation begins to fade. The person no longer waits for encouragement before acting. They no longer depend on recognition to maintain consistency. Their habits become expressions of personal commitment, rather than responses to social expectation. Even when external environments become chaotic or uncertain, their internal structure remains steady. This steadiness changes how they interact with the world. Instead of adjusting their effort based on who is observing, they maintain the same standard across different environments. Their behavior becomes less reactive to circumstances and more guided by principle. The discipline they once struggled to maintain now operates quietly in the background of their life. Others may not immediately notice this transformation, because discipline that is rooted internally often appears calm rather than dramatic. It does not demand attention. It does not rely on public recognition to exist. It simply continues day after day, shaping decisions and actions with quiet consistency. Over time, this internal discipline creates a different kind of psychological strength. The individual becomes less dependent on the emotional energy of others to maintain direction. Their focus does not fluctuate based on praise or criticism. Instead, their behavior reflects a stable alignment between their values and their actions. What once required external motivation becomes self-sustaining. And in that shift, discipline stops being something that must be constantly forced. It becomes a natural expression of a mind that has learned to govern itself without needing validation. The stability of inner authority. There is a point in personal development where something subtle begins to change in the way a person moves through the world. It does not come from a dramatic breakthrough or a sudden declaration of independence. Instead, it grows quietly from repeated moments in which the individual stops measuring their decisions against the reactions of others. Over time, those small moments accumulate and form a different internal posture, one that no longer depends on approval to remain steady. For most of their lives, people operate inside a system of invisible feedback. Praise encourages them to continue in a particular direction. Disapproval pushes them to reconsider. Approval provides emotional confirmation that their actions are acceptable. These signals shape behavior more than most people realize. They influence tone, opinions, decisions, and even identity itself. The difficulty is that approval is not stable. It shifts depending on context, environment, and the expectations of those present. What receives praise in one group may invite criticism in another. What feels acceptable in one moment may suddenly appear controversial in the next. When someone's internal stability depends heavily on these reactions, their sense of direction becomes uncertain. They begin adjusting themselves to maintain acceptance, often without noticing how frequently their choices are being redirected. But when a person gradually stops seeking approval as emotional confirmation, something different begins to form. Without the need to constantly secure validation, the mind becomes quieter. Decisions are no longer rushed in order to maintain agreement. Instead of reacting immediately to social pressure, the individual develops the ability to pause and evaluate. This pause creates space for reflection, and reflection begins to reveal patterns that were previously hidden. The person starts noticing how much energy had once been spent anticipating reactions. They remember how often they softened opinions to avoid discomfort. They see how quickly their confidence fluctuated depending on the approval of others. What once felt like natural social behavior now appears as a system that quietly influenced their thinking. Detachment interrupts that system. Detachment does not remove the individual from society. It simply removes the emotional dependency that once made approval feel necessary. The person can still listen, communicate, and participate fully in conversations. But internally, something has changed. Their sense of direction no longer depends on immediate agreement. This shift produces a different kind of calm. When approval is no longer required, criticism loses much of its destabilizing power. Instead of reacting defensively, the individual becomes capable of observing disagreement with curiosity. They can examine whether criticism contains useful information without feeling compelled to accept or reject it instantly. Praise is also received differently. It may be appreciated, but it does not define their sense of worth or certainty. The mind becomes less reactive, and in that reduced reactivity, a deeper form of clarity begins to develop. The individual's thinking becomes more deliberate, because it is no longer constantly adjusting to emotional signals from others. Instead of following the immediate atmosphere of the room, they evaluate situations based on their own reasoning and long-term understanding. This creates what might be called inner authority. Inner authority does not appear through loud confidence or visible dominance. It is much quieter than that. It shows itself through steadiness. The person speaks without urgency. They do not rush to defend themselves when challenged. They are comfortable allowing silence to exist after they express a thought. Others begin to notice this composure. In many environments, people are accustomed to seeing individuals adjust quickly in response to approval or criticism. Conversations often follow predictable patterns of reassurance and alignment, but the individual who has detached from the need for validation behaves differently. their reactions remain measured regardless of the emotional temperature of the room. This steadiness changes the dynamics of interaction. Because when someone is no longer seeking approval, they also stop providing the emotional signals that others rely on to guide their behavior. They do not rush to secure agreement, nor do they panic when disagreement appears. Their presence becomes grounded rather than reactive. Over time, this grounding develops into a form of quiet influence, not because the person attempts to control others, but because their composure creates stability in environments where reactions often escalate quickly. When tension rises, the individual remains calm. When opinions shift rapidly, their perspective remains consistent. Their thinking does not fluctuate depending on who is watching. This consistency strengthens identity. The individual no longer defines themselves through the fluctuating reactions of others. Their sense of direction becomes anchored in their own evaluation of reality. Praise and criticism become information rather than emotional commands. Eventually, something else becomes clear. The energy that was once spent managing approval becomes available for something more meaningful: observation, reflection, and intentional action. Without the constant need to secure acceptance, the mind gains the freedom to examine situations more carefully and move with greater precision. And with time, the individual begins to recognize the quiet advantage that comes from no longer seeking validation. Their choices are guided by clarity rather than reaction. Their confidence grows from internal alignment rather than external applause. The world around them continues to shift with opinions, expectations, and emotional currents, but their direction no longer moves with it.